Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I'm excited to be with you for today's Lunch and Learn with artist Kern Samuel. My name is Casey Dario. I'm the art director and exhibition design at the Newark Museum of Art. Today, I am visiting you from my apartment in Harlem. If you like today's program, please check out our hashtag NMOA at home series on our website and tune in tomorrow at 6 p.m. for our museum happy hour. And if happy hour isn't your thing, check out our upcoming Art on the Floor featuring printmaking this Saturday. At the end of our program, we will have a conversation Q&A. If you're watching on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions during the presentation. If you're joining us from Facebook, please type questions below in that comment box. And with that, I want to introduce Kern. Kern Samuel was born in Trinidad and Tobago, West Indies in 1990. At 14, his family migrated to the United States and settled in New Jersey. By that time, he had developed a strong passion for art and creativity and knew he wanted to be an artist. At 18, he received a full tuition scholarship to attend the Cooper Union in New York City. After college, he became interested in community building and went to Vermont to become a part of the Sable Project, a small off-the-grid artist community. There, he had the opportunity to collaborate with dance artists, often recalling his formative years at home with his mother to create original costumes for performances. From here, he took his interest in community and collaboration back to Newark, New Jersey, where he worked as an educator with us at the Newark Museum of Art. In 2016, he rented studio space to create a body of work that would ultimately be shown in an inspired group exhibition at Galleria Faro in Newark, New Jersey. Kern recently completed his MFA from the Yale School of Art, and you can view his thesis work along with his graduating class at a link that we're going to include in the comment section. His practice probes the entangled relationship between the inner and outer self, the skin and the soul, the interior and exterior body. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce an incredibly talented artist and my friend, Kern Samuel. Kern.
Thank you, Casey, for that amazing introduction, and thank you to the Newark Museum for hosting me today. I'm excited to go through these slides with everyone and talk a little bit about my work and my process and answer questions. Also, thank you, Casey, for reminding me of this work, which I made in 2017. At the time, I was a studio resident at Galleria Faro in Newark, New Jersey, and working part-time at the Newark Museum as a museum educator. So I would spend my mornings at the museum, working with children, trying to make connections between different objects in the collection. And in the afternoon, I would go to my studio and work on these paintings. Part of what inspired a lot of the work that I was making at Faro at the time was the work that I was doing at the Newark Museum. My job was mainly to make connections between different objects, artworks in the museum's collection, but also translate those connections to the students that would come to the museum for gallery tours. And we would build those connections by just looking at art objects through historical context, through personal narrative, but also through references to contemporary and popular culture. And so that work of building those connections really inspired what I was doing in the studio materially. So as you can see in this work, it's a quilted fabric work with figures painted on the surface. So I initially was thinking about the relationship between the substrate, which is in this case, it's a muslin, and my body or a body. I was thinking of muslin as clothing, or that had this connection to the body, things that you would wear. Muslin is also a material that you use to make a mock-up garment before you cut your garment in your nice fabric, or the fabric that you want the world to see when you wear it. I was also thinking about the relationship between the substrate and the medium. I was using acrylic paint, a very watered down acrylic paint that would soak into the fabric and almost become one with the fabric. So I was trying to emphasize that relationship between substrate and medium. Also the relationship between substrate and itself, the fact that these are rectangle pieces of muslin that are stitched together, making that connection from fabric to fabric. The physical stitching was a kind of formal way to explore that idea. The relationship to the figure within the composition, as you can see, there are two figures in an embrace, and how they're connected is in part due to the way that the fabric is sewn together, but also in the way that the figures seem to have an autonomous relationship with each other that is apart from my intention or my desire, but that they can have their own relationship, and that's okay. And the last relationship was between the figure and the background. So that parts of the figure that is represented is exactly the same material that is the background. So this relationship between figure and ground completely in question and completely destabilized. And it was sort of a material and formal way to kind of express these ideas of connection, or how to connect, or how art can connect to itself or to someone else. Yeah. And so this was the sort of like the ideas and the work that I was making before graduate school. In 2018, I started at Yale, and we can go to the next slide, pursuing my MFA in painting and printmaking at the Yale School of Art. And so those same ideas that I started at Gallery of Faro, I took with me. I think whenever you migrate, if you are someone who has a migration story, I think the things that you take with you are very important. And some of those things cannot be large physical things. A lot of those things are personal or cultural or ephemeral, or memories. So when I moved to my studio at Yale, I had very little material that I could take with me, but I took some of those ideas and some work that I made at Gallery of Faro. So I was still very interested in making connections, material connections and conceptual connections. But because I was in graduate school, I started to become more critical about what I was making and what I was thinking. And this led me to begin a practice of deconstructing some of the work that I was making at Gallery of Faro. So you can see in this figure, or in this image, it's still a quilted fabric piece, but the line drawn figure is deconstructed and rearranged on the surface. And the combination of blue and pink squares or rectangles or shapes creates another image, a secondary image. So there's like figures on a background, there's figures embedded in the background. And so I began playing with these ideas of embedded figures and figures in the background and figures as part of the background to kind of pull apart some of those works that I was making earlier. So the image that was created on the surface because of this kind of deconstruction, to me, seemed like two figures holding their hands up. And I think at the time, culturally in our society, there are lots of conversations about hands up, don't shoot, or police brutality, or issues with violence against, I guess, specifically unarmed Black men and women. And so the image of that was created with the pink material really began to me to seem evocative, and that I can begin to maybe push that narrative or explore that narrative a little bit more. This and this led me to think about how the figures could be wounded, which is where the red circles, how those were formed. They were additions to the surface. I cut through the surface and inserted these red, almost like portals or wounds, or to reference bullet wounds, but also perhaps to reference or to talk about this kind of like play or deconstruction with materials that I was working with. But because I was working in this way and thinking about the figures in this way, I realized that the pink figures could easily be related to pink skin. And so on some level, the figures were in fact racialized. And it was kind of thing, it's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And this idea that these pink figures were racialized made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I didn't necessarily feel 100% comfortable representing pink figures that were being sort of like shot or like wounded by bullets. But this particular discomfort is what that I felt after making this work marks the beginning of my interest in embodiment, actually, as a conceptual framework for my practice or for my interest moving forward. And then for me specifically, I was thinking about the embodiment of a particular subject. So that this figure had pink skin was kind of incidental, and I was thinking that I can be more intentional about what kinds of figures I wanted to represent and what those kinds of figures were doing or how they existed in the world or as art objects. So then we can go to the next slide. So the story of this work is that part of the discomfort was that I wanted to change the color of the figures. And so I painted the other side of the work brown. If we can go to the next slide. And so this is the other side of that very same work. You can see the same red wounds now inverted on the other side. And I painted the surface brown. But I didn't use the same sort of like techniques that I was using earlier with the very liquid acrylic paint. I used the acrylic paint in a more viscous texture. And it created a surface that was very, very artificial. So I was wanting to change the way I was representing figures, but actually making something or representing something that to me felt more artificial than where I started. And so the text, or adding the text, the blue text, was then a way to think about covering. So at some point, this work became a conversation with itself. So it was trying to reconcile both sides of itself. But then also it became a process of covering something that made you feel uncomfortable or discomfort with something else, but then that thing not necessarily working, and then covering it again with something. And that is kind of where how this piece developed and where I left it for the time being.
Kern, will you read for us what, there's poetry in it too. I know it's hard. You got to take a second to read through it. And I'm sure that has to do with, decoding and a number of reasons, but do you want to share what you wrote?
Yeah, it says, "Is there a place where the cool winds will soothe my stinging skin. And I think it was that writing or that poetry that really, that was the fulcrum or the jumping off point for thinking about skin or representations of skin or how to represent skin in a way that related more to an embodied subject, and that subject could be racialized or politicized, or that subject could be me. And I think that was the beginning of a real way to like open up the potential, what was possible.
Thank you.
In my practice. So we can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, the previous work was a jumping off point, which brings us to this work. And so still being interested in this idea of connection, still being interested in this relationship to fabric or muslin and the skin, I was still sewing and using fabric to sew and to make different forms through sewing, that process. But I wasn't necessarily sticking to a grid as I was before, as in a quilted piece. And I was using different types of material, of mediums other than acrylic. And so I wanted to explore how the materials, the form, and the structure of my work could relate to or speak to or point to a physical and a conscious subject. And I was thinking a lot about skin color, but also the function of skin as a physical covering. And I think it's typically the first thing you see on a person is, besides their clothing, is their skin. And I think that's part of the explicit meaning behind this work and some works that you will see after this, is that there is an explicit and an implicit meaning to subjectivity or to a subject or to something like skin. And in addition to the explicit kind of image of skin, I was also thinking about the accessibility of the materials that I wanted to use and its cultural implications also becoming part of the implicit meaning of the work. So things that you may not necessarily know by looking or seeing in it, but understanding a little bit about more of the materiality and how it's made can give you a different extend the meaning or the read of the work. And so for the medium, I was using makeup, cosmetics. So I went to the drugstore, which is a very accessible market for many people. And that is something that is also very important to me, is that where the materials come from are accessible or relative in some way to an everyday experience of a subject. So I went to the drugstore, which is a very familiar place, and looked at the range of pigments and colors in the makeup aisle and selected colors and pigments that matched my skin, or I thought matched my skin, or I tried to match to my skin, and began to use those pigments along with the sewing, along with the formal composition to create these skins. So we get to the next slide. So the first work, the first skin, the outside, I was thinking about just that, the kind of the explicit image of skin and what it looks like. The inside, I was thinking more about the function of the skin, and that to me, a skin, it has thickness, which means it has two sides, which was also very similar to the quilted works from earlier that now had these two sides. And even as, let's say, like a young person, and you're out in the world, like playing with your friends, and you cut yourself, you injure yourself, and you see that even though your skin is brown, or my skin is brown, under my skin is pink. And that is a kind of memory, or like a visceral, my visceral sort of like relationship to or one of my relationships to skin that was personal to me or specific to my experience in the world. And so the inside skin was a way to, honestly, to readdress the sort of like the pink figures from earlier, but also to recontextualize that idea of pink skin as an internal or interior side of my brown skin, which is just like anatomical or just like a matter of fact. You can go to the next slide. And then this is where the interior and the exterior combine. And this work was also kind of another jumping off point for works to come, works that I would make after this work. So this is not an anatomical work, but it reads very bodily. So in some way, I was back to where I started with the quilt works. I had made something that was reading in a way that I didn't necessarily intend or wasn't necessarily interested 100% in at the time of making it. So it was another moment of discomfort for me, which caused me to, as I mentioned, question my intentions and my materiality, and to question if there were other ways to speak critically about the body, subjectivity, or the body and subjectivity without the image or the allusion to an image or the allusion to the body that was so anatomical or so straightforward to me. I wanted to be more poetic, more abstract, which led me to thinking about inside the body beyond just like the inside of the skin, but the inside of the body as an organism, but also the inside of the body as sort of like a spirit or a soul or a consciousness, or all of the things that are perhaps metaphysical about the body that is a part of a subject. And I was thinking a lot about the senses and my senses and sense of smell and the sense of taste, which brought me to the next slide. So these were early experiments that I was making. I had decided that I wasn't going to use muslin anymore, because if I used muslin, I believe that I would naturally revert, well, maybe revert is not the right word, but I would naturally, maybe revert back to some of the more anatomical forms that I wanted to work against in a way, like be critical of that in a way. So these works on paper, using different types of materiality, were a response to that other thing that I made. And I was thinking a lot about materials that I had a sensual or sensorial relationship with. And so I was thinking about things that I eat, or things that I smell, or things that maybe I grew up with, things that I'm familiar with, and turmeric. And I grew up in the Caribbean, and I grew up eating a lot of curry. And turmeric is a spice that is in curry, but it also, as an aroma, it triggers memories, and it triggers the feeling of being home, or it triggers the memories of, different experiences from my time, from a long time ago. And in the same way, instant coffee, my dad worked at the Nestle company in Trinidad. And so instant coffee was something that was like, cans and cans of instant coffee and products like that were always kind of around the house. I don't drink coffee, but I know it has an effect, and I know that when you drink it, there is an effect. So there was a way that I was trying to use these materials to think about the body still, think about processes of the body, think about consumption and how we consume, but also how these materials related to a deeper cultural history, or related to memory, or related to parts of myself that were not necessarily physical, but that were real and that were part of my subjectivity. And I also think once I worked with the material, it kind of reminded me, like if you see on the right, the little bubble reminded me of a pimple. So all of a sudden I was back to this skin, even though I was trying to get away from it. Next slide. And so then I wanted to take this, I became very excited by the turmeric, and I wanted to expand it, and I wanted to think about it for all of its qualities, not only as a material that's personal to me, but also as a health product, as a material that is a cultural material, and a material, or a spice, I should say, or a food that is you can find anywhere in the world, um, which connects to colonial histories, and connects to migration, and connects to how cultures and people are connected in through spices and through these sensorial materials. And so I knew that I wanted to work more with this material, but I wanted to use it in a way that related to my current experience. And at the time, I was at school. So I made this piece, Threshold. It takes up the size of a double wide door. And these are the doors that are frequently used to go in and out of a critique space that we have at the Yale School of Art painting printmaking department called the Pit. So the Pit is a critique space, and it's named the Pit because it's kind of like a two-story basement that you can look down into, kind of like a coliseum, and you put your work in there, and then you and the faculty and your cohort and whoever else can come and critique your work. And so I wanted to create this work to interrupt that process somehow, by causing the people in the room, maybe including myself, to think about the space more as a body, as a collective body, and how we needed or depended on each other or relied on each other to make this body function and to make this body work in one way or the other. But then also, how does the architecture of a building, the architecture of a space, of an environment also affect a collective body, and how we what we think of our individual selves and what we think of each other. The turmeric also has a very strong aroma. So the piece, because of its size and because of its scale in terms of its relationship to the room and its relationship to the architecture of the room, its relationship to the way that we use our bodies, but also the way that it smells, became a way to think about my experiences and my histories and my own subjectivity as part of a larger subject, which is a community, or the people that you are spending most of your time with. And that I was trying to project my subjectivity into the space, so that people could smell and see and experience something that was very close to me. Next slide. And then we can go to the next slide. So this is a close-up of the work. So I poured layers and layers and layers of this turmeric mixture onto paper. And because the mixture is volatile, it begins to crumble and fall away. Every time I move it, every time it's moved, every time it's displayed, every time someone approaches it. So it has this relationship where it's reactive or responsive to its environment as well, which was way better than I expected the piece to the kinds of the conceptual frameworks of the work were way beyond my expectations.
I want to add to Kern. I know this is a little off book, but it feels like, it feels more architectural, as you said, but it's still a skin of something.
Right.
But it also like lends itself to feeling like art, earth art.
Mhm.
Did you think at all about that, or look into some of the well-known earth artists because of the volatility, the and the nature of decay
Mhm.
uh, that's in this new skin basically that you've created from turmeric?
Right. I wasn't necessarily looking at the earth artists from the 60s and 70s, perhaps. But I was thinking about, yes, the idea that this turmeric, this volatile turmeric mixture, when it dries, becomes a skin or skin-like, but also it had the image of rust, and these were metal doors that they were installed on. So I was making these formal connections between still thinking about image, still thinking about skin, still thinking about an internal and external, but um, shifting the logic around to make new strides, I think, in what was possible for this project, for the desire to represent a subject. And then the next slide. And this is the last work on my slide today. It's called Healing. I think I named this, most of my other works are named after the piece is finished, but I think I had a title for this work before I made it, particularly because I was still thinking about the turmeric as this colloquial healing medicinal food. People will call it like a superfood, or you find it in very expensive drinks, like health drinks at the corner store, things like that. Um, and so it was kind of, I guess, a little bit funny to me that that the turmeric, this material that had this very specific meaning for me individually, also had so many other types of meanings out in the world, and I couldn't necessarily control all of those things, um, but I can control what was happening in my studio, and that's where the kind of like the vacuum seal, the idea of a vacuum seal came, because I wanted to put things in there and seal them, and that would always be something that I had control, that it would I could seal objects, or I don't know, different things in there that are, maybe some of them are secrets, maybe some of them are just like uh, baggage, or emotions, or whatever it is I wanted to seal away, and then pouring the layers of turmeric over the vacuum sealed object, almost in a kind of like a ritualistic way, was a way to kind of like heal or process or like seal away um, uh, the things that I wanted to. This was also coming down to the end of my time at Yale, so it was also kind of symbolic to me to make work that tried to understood what had happened over the past 2 years, and but also acknowledge what had happened over the past 2 years, and honor what had happened over the past 2 years as well. One more slide. Yeah, and so this is just an idea of what the work looks like in a more dimensional representation. Um, I was really drawn to, I was really actually pleasantly surprised by the feeling of maybe like a lung or something being compressed, or I like the idea of it seeming to be a very dry surface that had like shriveled from a lack of moisture. Um, this gave the work a sense of existence to me that I think I was searching for this whole time, or still searching for in my practice. Um, and yeah, it was really, um, I don't like have a lot of words to say about it, but I have a lot to say about the experience of it, which is that it's very different from an image. As I mentioned, it has an aroma. It has a texture. It has a relationship to your own body in terms of scale. And it is healing.
Thank you so much, Kern. I know that we can't all see each other, but I think we should give him a round of applause because I know that we can sort of feel each other's energy. And that was amazing. It's so great to see how far you've grown since the studio visit, like 2017, I guess. And this new work is just really beautiful and powerful. We've got a number of questions coming in. I may also, just to answer one of the bigger questions of scale, because we see the numbers on each slide, we don't always understand
Mm-hmm.
how those translate. Again, I'm going to go off book again and just show, because this sort of answers the question about lift. This piece is in my personal collection, and it's huge. It's life size, and these other works that we have seen are very similar in scale. The works exploring the exterior interior body are on the same scale. The beautiful giant architectural turmeric works are, the size of, big doorways. So this in person, when we're all able to see artwork again and experience it, smell it, feel it, when museums open again, is totally transcendent. And I think you did a great job explaining that. I feel it, and I hope that the viewers are feeling it too. So with the beginning of the Q&A, we had some questions from Heather Craig. Where is Lift? Can I go and see it? I'm sorry, we'll do better to get it out there online. I hope to one day share it so more people can see it. Next question on Lift is, I love the first piece, Lift, you presented. I wanted to know, did you also have in mind the saying, I am my brother's keeper, when you were creating this artwork?
Not specifically, but I think that sentiment makes a lot of sense to me. I think, yeah, that sentiment makes a lot of sense to me. I think the job that I did at being a museum educator, it wasn't the highest paying job, but I think I really enjoyed the experience of working with student groups because I could learn from them and they could learn from me, and it would be an experience that you couldn't necessarily put a price on, which is, to me, is a very similar sentiment of being your brother's keepers. How can you help someone in your community or do a service for a community or your community, or someone else?
I think we can all agree that like a beautiful thing in artwork is like the personal experience that like the viewer gets, as well as hearing the story of the creation. And for me, when I saw it, like there were a ton of different levels of, support and supporting your brother and male. And I don't necessarily think that like you made it from a like queer perspective, but for me, there's obviously that moment of support, intimacy. And I think that it's great that each person can have their own reaction. Um, Next question is about the works with turmeric. Uh, Turmeric has also been exoticized a fair bit in the current times. Did that play into your thinking while making these works?
Yeah, I think that's part of the kind of like the cultural analysis that like I was seeing the use of turmeric in these like, expensive drinks and as a superfood and which and it is all of those things, but to me it represented a personal history, but also like thinking about why I was eating curries in the Caribbean. That leads into questions of colonialism and the migration of foods and spices and materials with the movement of people across and cultures across the globe. So yeah, I think I was using it. I felt empowered to use it because of its personal connection, the connection I had with it, but also that it is this exploited material that has a lot of conceptual potential for future works or for opening up conversations about exploitation in artwork.
On that, there's also the question that turmeric and ginger are related, and why I guess you chose to focus on turmeric as the essential choice.
So it's, part of it was also a formal decision. I am still an artist. I am still, in some ways, a formalist. And so the yellow color is part of like the chemical quality of turmeric. You can extract the yellow and use it as a pigment or a dye. And I think the vibrancy of the color and was very striking. And it's another way to get someone to come a little closer, look a little closer, or to, it's like that explicit experience that then leads to an implicit understanding or implicit meaning.
Thank you. This one is, it's going to take me a minute to ask the question. It's a little long, but it comes from Holly Bushman. It says, "Hi, Kern. Thank you for your talk. It is really fascinating to hear you talk so eloquently about your practice. I was particularly struck by how you discussed the last work, healing. You say that you are interested in the myriad meanings a material might take on and how your understanding of a material might mean something very different to your audience. Could you talk a little more about this idea of control or lack thereof in your practice, particularly as it pertains to the ways in which you interact with an audience or navigate the boundaries between your own subjectivity and the subjectivity of your audience?" I want to help unpack that. I'm just not sure. Maybe there's something that you
Yeah.
can zoom
Well,
in.
I think I understand the essence of the question, which is to, at least I can restate it in this way. How am I trying to control the experience of the people who, or the viewer of my work? And in some ways, yes, there is some level of, there is some desire within me that wants someone to, yes, experience a turmeric through smell and through scale and through color. And I think that's part of making any, or making art for me, is that it is, I'm not making it in a vacuum, and I'm making it for consumption. And that's something that I learned at the museum as well, is that it has to translate or relate to someone, otherwise it's useless. Like if you can't convince someone that this is something that, you know, matters on a spiritual level, on a physical level, on a whatever, cultural level, community level, then like it doesn't, right?
Mhm.
And so I think, yes, part of that control is trying to say to the person who's gonna, the viewer, the person who's not me, that it's okay to engage with this artwork. It's okay to come a little closer. It's okay to have questions. And you may not necessarily learn everything about the artist by looking at the artwork, but you may learn something about uh, my humanness or my desire to, communicate something about my humanity to you through my artwork.
That's beautiful, and I think that answers it above and beyond. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I obviously want to also just celebrate when people say, "Great job, wonderful conversation," from our friend Adrian Price. We're getting a lot of love. And here's a good question. Who would you say are your major influences? You know, you can list an artist, you can list someone in popular culture, you can list, I think it's an open-ended question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm influenced by ways of making. And I
Mm,
think that I learned from my mom a lot about how to make something in a way that you want it to be made, and like what is like making something well and what is making something not well. And those things are relative to your desires. And that was something that was really important, a really important piece of information that I learned from earlier on. But I'm generally influenced by everyday experiences. I can be influenced by someone riding their bike down the street tomorrow. And then, so I think obviously as someone who's been through a undergrad and graduate program, there are a number of artists that I reference or look at or consider or read about. There are a lot of theories and criticisms that I engage with and read. But I think in terms of what is a constant influence, it is, kind of everyday experience.
This one is relative to quilting. As your work has evolved, have your feelings or understandings about quilting changed? And I guess that's to some of the earlier works where you were piecing things together.
Wait, can you repeat one? Sorry.
The question is about your feelings or understandings about traditional quilting or, creating quilted works.
Oh, yes. So I was looking at the Gee's Bend quilters in Gee's Bend, Alabama, I believe. And they were mostly women who were taking work clothes that you couldn't wear as work clothes anymore and turning them into these amazing abstract quilts. And these quilts were being produced at the same time as the kind of like the general art world was concerned with kind of like abstract expressionism and these kinds of like big, typically male, typically white artists who were painting and exhibiting in major galleries and museums. And so I always thought that was an interesting dichotomy, that you have these women who were not classically trained in a Western context, but were making these quilts that were filled with history, that were filled with emotion, that were filled with technique, and that were filled with incredible aesthetic intuition and ability. And I was just very inspired to quilt because of that, but also this idea that the stitching of the fabric was a way to bring the pieces together. And there's also forms of quilting in culture, like the AIDS quilt, for example, where this idea of the union of materials through stitching or quilting has a very human quality.
Thank you. And I also just want to say, like, I think it's, it's always important for us to do, our research and look at like people that are less well known. And I mean, there's inspiration everywhere and throughout history. There are a ton of artists that have gone overlooked. So, if you're interested in a process or technique, get out there, research, look for these individuals. Hopefully one day they will have their spotlight as well, but we can learn a lot from the people who did not get the limelight when a certain type of work was popular. I want to, I think, end with this. This seems like a really good question to end with, from Lynn Mazza Hillway. Your healing ended in the internal or spiritual realm. What are your plans going forward? Any ideas of reconnecting the surface flesh with the spirit and perhaps the connection, interplay, struggle?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely still struggling, which is a good thing. And I haven't had a studio for a few months, but I recently got one. So I have a studio now. And similar to the way that when I got to Yale, I sort of brought all these works and began to deconstruct them, I will bring the works that I made at Yale to my new studio and then begin to look at them all together and begin to see what other kinds of connections that could be made between them, and then begin working materially. I usually start materially, and then through working materially, I begin to think about all the other sort of like aspects of what I'm doing in terms of like spirituality, in terms of how to connect the skin to the soul. And I think writing is also very important. I think in the interim, I've been doing a lot of writing and trying to form language around what I'm interested in or what I would like to do in the future, continue to do. So, yeah. definitely struggle.
Well, excellent, Kern. And this was a lot of fun. I love, again, seeing your work. Uh, do you have anything else you want to let us know? Any summer plans as we say goodbye?
No, I'm just here in New Haven, and yeah, thank you for this opportunity, and yeah, I had a really good time.
Well, we're excited to continue to watch you grow and to see what you create after this quarantine and this important time to heal ourselves is we work through it. So thank you, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. I appreciate it. And again, check out hashtag NMOA at home for more upcoming events. Thank you, Kern.
Thank you.